The 1180 BC sling bullets lay untouched, revealing the legendary Trojan defenders never came back. You visualize a defiant, heroic final stand. Brilliant princes fighting to the last drop of blood before being cleanly wiped from the earth. Archaeology delivers something significantly colder. Heaps of highly usable ammunition remained scattered directly outside the palace and defensive perimeters. Why does this incredibly specific detail annihilate the romance of epic poetry? Victorious armies immediately reclaim their ground. If the besieged forces had successfully held the line, they would have carefully collected those valuable stones to hurl again tomorrow. Leaving them completely abandoned dictates that the commanding forces lost absolute control over their own streets. Panic entirely replaced structured order. The men who owned the site lost the fundamental right to walk over it. Fire swept rapidly through the defensive perimeter, disturbing burials and choking the architecture with violent destruction debris. A heavy fortress can endure a physical breach. It absolutely cannot survive the sudden, total evaporation of spatial command. Your brain desperately demands a clean cinematic ending where the attackers instantly exterminate the population. The dirt actively contradicts your expectations. Troy 7b, the phase immediately following the disaster, shows the settlement limping forward in a severely reduced form. Total extinction is a comforting fabrication. Part of the local population stubborn stayed, gradually mixing with incoming people who brought strange, handmade barbarian wear. The brutal scar remained, but the patient refused to die quickly. This long, messy survival ruins the crisp narrative closure you inherently crave. Decades dragged into centuries before clear, Greek settlers fully Hellenized the scarred hill. Fame arrived exceptionally late to a community that had already endured a grinding, unglamorous transition out of power. The people dying in that horrific collapse were not alien species separated by deep biology. They shared the exact same Bronze Age, Aegean, Anatolian ancestral continuum as the men actively slaughtering them. That single genetic revelation cuts significantly deeper than the physical violence. You were conditioned to divide this ancient world perfectly into two hostile, unrelated camps. Greek heroes standing in righteous opposition against Trojan princes. Two distinct bloodlines. Yet ancient DNA extracted from Mycenaeans exposes deep ancestral roots connecting them heavily to early Western Anatolian farmers. Troy sat directly inside that identical, shared demographic neighborhood. The rigid border between these legendary enemies turns incredibly porous. We are not watching total strangers accidentally collide on a battlefield. We are watching intimate regional neighbors forcefully make themselves foreign. Does this uncomfortable closeness make the Iliad feel less historically important? It makes the tragedy infinitely heavier, because when biological division completely fails to explain the visceral hatred, human politics must carry the entire burden of the war. This harsh political reality forces you to pivot east toward the Hittite Empire. Their heavily guarded clay tablets recorded a bustling, heavily monitored city named Wilusa. This discovery entirely rearranges the geopolitical map sitting inside your head. Troy was never a lonely Western prize waiting passively for Greek ships to arrive. It functioned as an Anatolian vassal, constantly caught inside the grinding gears of massive Eastern diplomacy. Empires watched its every diplomatic move. If the local rulers miscalculated their alliances, the penalty was not a bruised reputation. The penalty was total imperial erasure. Ahiyawa, representing the Mycenaean world, exerted relentless pressure from across the sea, while Hittite overlords demanded absolute loyalty by land. The city operated as a volatile, highly contested hinge, and when a violent conflict erupts within a connected network, the destruction spreads rapidly through deeply familiar roads. The men screaming across the barricades shared deep roots, yet they answered to rival kings. Identity became a lethal weapon. Labels manufactured an illusion of total difference where the physical bones showed undeniable, continuous regional kinship. You constantly project this identical flaw onto the deep past. We automatically assume that if two ancient populations slaughtered each other, they must have originated in completely separate human universes. History aggressively mocks that psychological comfort. The most savage rivalries frequently detonate directly between cousins. The Troy picture, suggested by the Hittite tablets and the DNA, reveals a landscape where people were near in ancestry but far in allegiance. They split over prestige, control of trade routes, and access to power, not because they possessed fundamentally opposite bloodlines. Epic poetry requires stark, high-contrast identities to function. It actively builds heroes by drawing sharp, artificial lines across blurry, mixed human zones. DNA sides with messy entanglement. The conflict remains, but the simplicity completely collapses. War survives the removal of biological destiny. If tracking the localized ancestry of a single city fractures your assumptions, tracking the origins of entire populations will completely shatter them. A 6,700-year-old genetic signature belonging to an early Anatolian farmer emerged flawlessly from the laboratory. Geographic common sense forcefully dictates that the clearest living descendants must currently walk the streets of modern Anatolia. They do not. The highest concentration of that deep heritage survives thousands of miles west, locked securely on the island of Sardinia. How does the geographic center utterly lose its defining genetic code while the remote edge successfully archives it? Ancestry behaves like a shifting delta, not a static piece of inherited property. Waves of later migrations, violent admixtures, and relentless population churn violently reshaped the Aegean mainland. The original Neolithic profile did not cleanly vanish into thin air. It became deeply submerged beneath relentless layers of incoming humanity until it no longer closely matched those old genomes. Sardinia miraculously preserved a massive share of that old signal specifically because it avoided the heaviest continental traffic. The island acts as a living, breathing memory vault. Your mind inherently craves simple narratives of total extinction or perfect continuity. The data delivers chaotic, continuous dilution. If the very birthplace of a foundational human group no longer holds its clearest biological reflection, geography is actively lying to you. Continuity of physical land guarantees absolutely nothing about the continuity of the profile living on it. Time functions as a vicious eraser in the heartland and an accidental preserver in the periphery. You continually stop asking where an ancient people originated, and you are forced to ask where they survived best. Those two questions rarely point to the exact same location on the map. The old population did not disappear in a dramatic movie sense. Their genetic shape was broken up, absorbed, and carried forward in microscopic fragments. This relentless human movement forces a direct confrontation with the most persistent, ugly myth regarding prehistoric warfare. Popular imagination desperately clings to a cinematic explanation for ancient conflict. Men routinely raided neighboring camps, violently abducted the women, and plunged whole regions into a continuous cycle of revenge. It feels raw, brutal, and historically authentic. Ancient genetics systematically dismantle this satisfying, violent legend. Female skeletons repeatedly register as exogenous outsiders when chemically compared to the local males buried right beside them. Your immediate instinct screams that these women were stolen prizes. You vividly picture forced marches and burning villages. But the broader DNA data exposes a massive, highly organized system known as patrilocal marriage. Women continuously crossed territorial boundaries to establish binding alliances, while male lineages remained strictly anchored to their specific terrain. This mechanism was not a chaotic symptom of endless raiding. It functioned as the fundamental architecture of prehistoric society, heavily dictating where strangers became family. Are we staring at a peaceful, utopian landscape of gentle family exchange? The Earth rejects that comfort instantly, because the identical world that carefully negotiated marriage ties also occasionally exploded into catastrophic, deliberate slaughter. Specific massacre sites routinely reveal mass graves containing women and children drawn from multiple different communities. These individuals were not carefully spared as romantic trophies. They were brutally executed alongside the men. When severe violence erupted, it did not selectively harvest brides. It completely consumed the entire social network. The proximity generated by intermarriage did not stop the killing. It ensured the resulting trauma was agonizingly intimate. You deeply want a single, bloody master cause for every ancient battle. Instead, you are forced to navigate a terrifying reality where communities relied on outsiders to survive, yet could still annihilate them without the slightest hesitation. This agonizing blend of survival and destruction brings the focus violently back to the charred ashes of Wilusa. When the city finally broke, the legendary population did not simply vanish overnight. The layers directly following 1180 BC reveal a crippled settlement limping forward in a severely reduced state. The old inhabitants persisted, stubbornly mixing with incoming groups who introduced strange handmade wares into the local production cycle. The community haphazardly patched itself together, absorbing new influences while aggressively maintaining fragments of the old local habits. It did not die cleanly like a majestic poem. It endured a grinding, humiliated persistence. Centuries dragged on before arriving Greek settlers finally established a clearly Hellenized presence on the scarred hill around 900 to 700 BC. The glamorous identity we retroactively assign to the site only bloomed after a massive, unrecorded period of desperate human transition. Fame routinely ignores the messy bridge of physical endurance, so who truly inherited the biological legacy of this catastrophic regional collision? If you demand a perfect, unbroken lineage, the Eastern Mediterranean will completely crush your expectations. Modern Greeks secured a staggering biological triumph. Despite absorbing profound waves of later migrations, their genetic profile still securely anchors to the ancient Mycenaean world. They adapted, shifted, and survived without severing the living physical cord connecting them to the Bronze Age. They kept their language, their defining culture, and a highly visible piece of their ancestral body. Troy experienced an infinitely more diffuse, brutal destiny. The descendants of the defeated did not successfully isolate themselves into a protected descendant bubble. They relentlessly dissolved. Their regional ancestry folded permanently into the massive demographic tides of later Anatolian, Roman, and Turkish eras until the original Trojan identity ceased to exist as a discrete biological population. You cannot isolate a modern group and definitively declare them the untouched, pure manifestation of the Trojan defenders. That biological perimeter collapsed completely, yet the city itself engineered the ultimate psychological victory. It effectively hijacked the memory of every subsequent empire that marched across the region. Rome aggressively claimed Trojan blood to validate its own supremacy. Conquerors constantly visited the ruins to bathe in the reflected glory of a war they had absolutely nothing to do with. While the physical people evaporated entirely into the surrounding landscape, the name achieved a staggering, untouchable immortality. The Greeks definitively retained the body. The Trojans permanently became the ghost. We remain dangerously obsessed with finding clean origins in a past that was engineered exclusively through aggressive, chaotic blending. Purity is merely an illusion we project onto history to make the horrific violence feel organized. The dirt beneath our feet refuses to support the comfortable fiction of isolation. This revelation demands a terrifying re-evaluation of every conflict you currently believe you understand. You have been systematically trained to view the ancient world as a board filled with sealed-off peoples, each one proudly marching under a simple biological label. The reality exposes a connected region characterized by massive overlap, intimate kinship, rapid exchange, and rival power centers desperately trying to push that overlap into completely separate camps. We keep desperately searching for ancestry to do the heavy lifting that politics, wounded pride, and constructed culture actually did. The DNA rigidly strips that comfort away, leaving a much harder shape behind. A war can be devastatingly real without requiring the two sides to come from fundamentally separate bloodlines. This changes the emotional weather of the entire human timeline. The hostility becomes far more deliberate, and the boundaries become dangerously constructed. If a city this universally legendary can completely lose its genetic identity while simultaneously conquering human memory, how many other famous ancient enemies were actually close family members who simply forgot their own names?